Now, you do have something else. When people have schooling, it's arbitrary as well to a degree. When people have schooling, a lot of schooling, and they're in positions of power, they're the ones who dictate right? What the rest of us use, and we pretty much conform. All right? And what people who have schooling use, that's called the standard. And what people who don't have that much schooling use, what the people with schooling reject, that's called the non-standard. All right? Standard is what people with schooling use and pass on to their children. The non-standard is what they don't use routinely. So for example, in English, I don't is fine, right? What about she don't? Is that English? That's English, of course. Now the question is it standard or non-standard? It's non-standard. Why? Because if you poll most people who speak English natively, take 100 people at random, I'll bet you anything that at least 90% will not use she don't routinely. And if they have a child who says she don't, they will make that child conform to the standard. They don't pass it on. So you have myself, yourself, ourselves, and so forth. How about his self? Standard or non-standard? I think most people will classify that as non-standard. Is it English? Yes, it is. So we have to be careful. Likewise, Spanish. All right? You have something like the following. Well, onta, that's casual, but what about this? How do you say, I translated? No, I produced in Spanish. Anyone? I produced? Yo? Produje. Is there another way of saying it? Producí, exactly. Both are Spanish. They're both Spanish. Why? Because Spanish speakers say both. Now the question is, which one is the standard? Produje. Produje. All right? So please keep that in mind. When we approach the Nahuatl, we have to consider dialect on the one hand. Regional variation, we have to consider style as well, whether it's formal or casual, and then we have to consider whether it is standard or non-standard. All right? What we're going to be going over is what is reflected in the manuscripts of beginning of the 16th century, right? That reflects the usage long before then, and that generally is formal. All right? So, the articulation is more careful. So something like moispansin today in a casual conversation will sound more like moispanse. They're both Nahuatl. Which one is correct? They're both correct. One is formal, more literary. The other one is more conversational. So you have to keep that in mind. It's careful articulation here. All right? Does that make sense? Any questions so far?
And how are you,
Please.
How are you going to differentiate between classical and contemporary? It's not quite the same thing, right?
Well, it's a good question and a very relevant one. It's the same way in which we differentiate between, let's say, 16th century English, literary English, and contemporary spoken English. All of you speak English here, I assume. I imagine that most of you grew up speaking English. How many of you have tried to read Shakespeare's sonnets? Right? You can understand the words. Can you really grasp the meaning without really thinking about it? No, it's difficult. It's difficult. Likewise, if you speak Spanish natively, try reading the works of people such as Lope de Vega, a playwright from the 16th century, or Tirso de Molina of the 16th century, and you might have a hard time with it. You'll recognize some of the words, well, actually all of the words, but the constructions are a little bit different. They're more elaborate.
And will the meanings also change?
The meanings will change to some degree. For example, in Spanish, cuidaban su ciudad con mucha policía. What does that mean? A lot of cops? Well, that's what it would mean to us. But if you go back to the 16th century, that's not what policía meant then. It meant care, with great care. Right? So in the 16th century, Nahuatl, before then, let's take the term masewali. Masewali. If you take the word apart, ma means hand, sewa means to rest, masewali, it's the resting of the hands. What comes after the resting of the hands after doing work? In other words, the reward. And that's a term that is applied to humans in general. Well, masewaltin, human beings in general. There's one particular story which tells of the creation when Quetzalcoatl goes to Mictlan, which you're familiar with, right? And he picks up the bones, and then he and Quilasli go to Omeyocan, the place of the duality. They grind the bones, and then from that, the human race is created for the fifth and final time. The last line of that particular story ends like this: Otlactoque, which means they spoke. Otlacatque, they came into being. Who? Inteteo, Inmasehualtin, the creative ones, the people, the humans. If you take the word apart, how it's used in the 16th century, rulers, when they give advice to their children, refer to themselves as Timasehualtin, we humans. 21st century, now at central Mexico, Mexico City, in rural areas surrounding Mexico City, Masehualtin means what? Campesino. You know, the other sense of human in general is gone. So there have been changes here and there. The structure of the language pretty much remains the same, except that you have more elaborate constructions at that time in the literature that has survived, and it's understandable. It's understandable. But pretty much basic words like parts of the body or people, like Siwat still is, you know, a woman, and Oquichli still is man, and so forth. Dialectical variations in Veracruz, it's Sowat, right, rather than Siwat. But yeah, you can't tell the difference. Certain constructions have changed to a great degree. I'm going to go over one of them in our discussion of the grammar. For example, English and Nahuatl have some similarities. In English, when you have a verb and you put a noun in front of it, the noun tells you how the action of the verb is being performed, or by what means. For example, make, to make. That's the verb, action word. Hand, noun. Put it in front of make. To hand make something means what? To make by means of the hand, right? To potty train means to train with regard to what? Going to the bathroom. So that is identical to classical Nahuatl. So if you want to say chiwa, that means to make, and if you want to say to make by hand, you simply place ma in front of it. Ma chiwa, which means to make something by hand, by means of the hand. That has changed to a degree. So for example, another one, which I have in here, I believe, choca, which means to cry. Kone choca means to cry like a child. It does not mean the child cries. But if you present something like that to a contemporary speaker of Nahuatl, as I have, they'll misinterpret it and they'll say, the child cries. Because the construction is now different. So, I tried this, I tried to get help from a contemporary speaker of Nahuatl in analyzing ancient texts, and I've had as much luck as I had in seeking aid from my grandmother and my parents in understanding 16th century Spanish. As much luck, I assume, as I would have in going to a farmer in England and asking for help in the reading of Shakespeare. The fact that they speak the language doesn't mean that they know all the constructions. Fortunately, you do have, especially in the Milpa Alta area of Mexico City, Nahuatl speakers who grew up speaking the language and who are now studying the classical form, which to me is so encouraging. And there is even an association of authors, writers, in indigenous languages. It's called ELIAC. Has anyone ever heard of that? Escritores en Lenguas Indígenas. One of the co-founders and past president is Librado Silva Galeana. I see that you have a dictionary there. He was the copy editor for that dictionary.